John F. Kennedy Jr., A Nation Waits continues.
Good evening again. I'm Peter Jennings. Some wise person remarked not too long ago that in this age of celebrity, we all become members of the international family. Doesn't really matter always whom tragedy strikes. In the case of the Kennedys, of course, they've been with the country for so very long, for so very, very long. Not many people knew John F. Kennedy well, I suspect, but one of the people in our field who knew him well as I think journalists do, is Barbara Walters.
I don't want to say that I knew him well. I did not know him well, but I had spent some time with both him and Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. You mentioned that he had had so much responsibility in his life, Peter, and indeed he had. So that to a lot of us, it's surprising to learn that he might have been a risk taker. You know, flying without a co-pilot in a single-engine plane. So much had happened to him just in the last few years. His mother's death in May of 1994. In 1995, he starts to publish this magazine, George. A lot of people said it was not going to make it. In 1996, he marries Carolyn Bessette, who had not been in the spotlight, who, by the way, his mother had never met. And this seemed to be now a very good time in his life. The magazine seems to have made it. He had become a reporter himself, doing some very good journalistic pieces, some very good interviews. Marriage, 3 years old, seemed to be strong. The paparazzi were no longer on his back all the time. And yet, Peter, he was famous indeed, wasn't he, from the moment he was born. If we ever had a collective national photo album, the pictures of John F. Kennedy Jr. would at once be instantly familiar to millions of us, and of course bring back a flood of memories. And no wonder.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
He was born within weeks of his father's election, the only child ever born to a president-elect. A living reminder that the nation had elected a young 42-year-old as its leader.
You have to remember that both my sister and I, particularly myself, view my father's administration through the color of others and the perceptions of others and through photographs and through what we've read. And so it's difficult for us to discern much about him independently of what other people's impressions are.
John Jr., whom his family called John John, seldom talked with reporters about himself or his memories. But 7 years ago, he and his sister Caroline did tell our Jay Shadler about some special times so long ago.
Do you have any memories of your dad at all?
I have a few. He had this desk in the Oval Office, which belonged to a sea captain. And it was made from an American frigate. And I just remember the inside you could climb around in, and there were kind of cavernous spaces in it. And we used to
remember crawling inside?
Yeah, and just hanging out there. And he used to give us chewing gum, because my mother didn't like us to chew gum. So we used to go over to the Oval Office at night, and he'd feed us gum under the desk.
There's a shot that I always recall is you all going out to meet your father at the helicopter. Do you remember the White House helicopter coming down? Or?
Oh, sure. That was a big excitement.
A big event?
Right.
And who could ever forget that searing image, now ingrained in all our memories? Within a few days, shy of his 3rd birthday, as a toddler, he saluted his slain father's coffin as it passed him by.
It's not something, frankly, I mean, I know this is hard to believe, but it's not a subject which I've spent a great deal of time analyzing. I understand that that was obviously a very historically significant event. He was a president. And there are people who, historians, filmmakers, et cetera, who are going to make money and time studying that. Whatever they decide or whatever they find is not going to change the one fundamental fact in my life, which is that it won't bring him back.
Shortly after the assassination, Jacqueline Kennedy moved her family here to an apartment in New York City. There were semblances of a normal life, but 5 years later, Bobby Kennedy, who had become a surrogate father to John and his sister, was assassinated too. And within 4 months, Jacqueline Kennedy married Greek shipping tycoon Aristotle Onassis, Pierre Salinger remembers it well.
Jackie came into my office and she told me something which I've never forgotten. She said, you know, I only have one thing to do in life now. I have to take care of these kids. I have to bring them up. I have to get them intelligent. I have to get them into good shape so that they can go into a real career in the future. Because if I don't do that, they'll be totally linked to their father's death.
For years after Bobby Kennedy's death, John Jr. was largely out of public sight. Photographers managed to occasionally get a glimpse of him, almost always with his mother close by. And as a foreshadowing of things to come, whenever he did appear in public, it was a guarantee of a media mob. John and his sister Caroline returned to New York City after Aristotle Onassis' death, and John began to emerge in controlled situations. The dedication of the JFK Library in Boston was a prime example in October of 1979.
I think continually of those who from the womb remembered the soul's history through corridors of light.
John Jr. seemed to have trouble finding himself as a young man. He attended the prestigious Phillips Exeter Academy in Massachusetts and Brown University, where he thought he wanted to be an actor. Biographer Wendy Lee.
John was very able to throw himself into another character to become someone else, and perhaps in a strange way that was his escape, his only escape from the role of being John F. Kennedy, Jr.
He was graduated from Brown University in 1983 to the cheers of an adoring family. After Brown University, expectations for the son of America's most famous dynasty were huge. His path was uncertain, and the public scrutiny was unrelenting. He never did become an actor, but instead, JFK Jr. attended law school in New York City. Speculation was that it was Jackie who wanted it that way.
Jackie put her foot down and said, you will not be an actor, you will be in a profession, and made him go to NYU Law School.
Politics may not have been his chosen career path, but he had all the right stuff. In 1988, a 27-year-old John Kennedy Jr. electrified the Democratic National Convention when he delivered the keynote address.
An unwavering commitment to the poor, to the elderly, to those without hope, regardless of fashion or convention, is the greatest reward of public service.
His speech earned him a 2-minute standing ovation, but his law career got Bronx cheers. The tabloids had a field day with his failure to pass the bar exam twice.
When I failed the bar exam, that was the New York Post had the headline, "The Hunk Flunk," so some of that I could actually do without.
The third try was a charm.
How do you feel about that? Is it true that you passed the bar?
Apparently it's true. I got the official word not long ago, so it's true.
And he eventually took a job at the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. But it was not John Kennedy's public life that became the object of so much fascination. It was his private life. The paparazzi followed him everywhere. If JFK Jr. was in the park, it made the news. The man whom People magazine chose as the sexiest man alive became Manhattan's most eligible bachelor. He was as handsome as any movie star and was himself attracted to Hollywood beauties. There were rumors of a relationship with Madonna. Do you mind all the stuff about you?
What stuff?
The stuff about being sexy and attractive, and every time you see another woman, there's all of this. Is she the one? Is this the one?
Listen, people could say a lot worse things about you, right? And then you were attractive and you look good in a bathing suit.
For 5 years, actress Daryl Hannah was the one, and the couple was seen everywhere. But the romance fizzled. Although JFK Jr. could not help being in the news, he seemed to steer clear of the scandals that plagued so many of the rest of the Kennedy clan. When cousin William Kennedy Smith went on trial, accused of rape, JFK Jr. was there to support him. He also campaigned publicly when his other family members ran for office. All during this time, JFK Jr. enjoyed a special closeness with his mother. She was his friend, his confidant, and the guiding force in his life. But tragedy struck when Jackie Onassis was diagnosed with cancer. John Kennedy Jr. was at his mother's side during her final days. Outside her Fifth Avenue apartment, the world's press waited in anxious vigil. Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis died in May of 1994, and John Kennedy emerged from the glamorous high-rise that he had lived in as a child to announce to the world that his mother had passed away.
Last night at around 10:15, my mother passed on. She was surrounded by her friends and her family and her books and the people and the things that she loved, and she did it in her own way and on her own terms, and we all feel lucky for that. And now she's in God's hands.
With his mother's death, John Jr. seemed suddenly more mature. The little boy America had held so dear was now all grown up. Famous children seem to have an extra burden to find themselves, to be themselves. Do you think you have found yourself?
I think part of what famous children have is that they have an abundance of opportunity, and that life circumstances doesn't force them to, choose, and you got to choose. I don't think that I've seen as many of you in one place since they announced the results of my first bar exam. So
it seemed inevitable that his fate
nice
and
to see you all
politics
again.
would one day intertwine. What no one expected was that John would choose the role of observer rather than participant. In 1995, the son of the 35th President of the United States unveiled his new magazine named for the first.
Ladies and gentlemen, meet George.
You have avoided the press, have now made yourself, in a sense, one of them.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, you can't beat them, join them, right? Here are your messages, Mr. Cohen.
The irreverent magazine seemed an instant hit, and it gave its famous publisher the chance to shine in a new career as a journalist. Kennedy bylines appeared on sharp-witted interviews with Colin Powell, former Clinton press secretary Mike McCurry, and Garth Brooks.
And how long will it take us?
In 2 nights.
Did you discuss this magazine with your mother?
Yeah.
What'd she say?
Yeah. Well, I think we showed her in mock cover, and she was a little skeptical. But I think that she had always encouraged both Caroline and I to make our own way, to not subordinate our own lives to the expectations of what we should do with our lives. And so in that respect, I think she got a kick out of it.
Ultimately, it was a tall, statuesque blonde named Carolyn Bessette, a public relations executive, who put an end to Kennedy's bachelorhood. Reports had surfaced that they were close, there were a few pictures snapped, but the couple's courtship remained largely private, so private that the world was stunned in September of 1996 when the wedding was announced, after it had already happened.
The world's most eligible man is no longer eligible. He's pretty much our crown prince, and now he's no longer free to be married. He is married.
In the last year, the young Kennedys had settled into their lives. The press seemed less a factor. The magazine was doing well. The Martha's Vineyard home they were heading to last night was their retreat. And you know, Peter, as we talk about this and talk about the relationship that JFK Jr. had with his mother, I think what so many of us must be thinking is, how would she, had she lived, been able to emotionally withstand this?
Well, I must tell you, first of all, that's a very beautiful piece of work you've put together, and I'm struck by the fact that I recognize virtually everything that's happened, which is a reminder, of course, how public the Kennedy relationship has been with us in the country as a whole. And he's 38, his mother was only 64 when she died, and his father was only 8 years older than him when he was assassinated.
One of the people that they just talked to said he was our crown prince. And we think of him, so many people, as the American prince. I mean, it is a cliche to say that he is American royalty, that the family is American royalty. And earlier today, without making too much of a connection, we were saying that in this country, it has some of the feeling of Princess Diana's death. I mean, he is our royalty. If he has died too young. He had a life of vulnerability. People could relate to him. He was also as handsome as she was beautiful. I mean, the mythical elements of it is what's keeping us talking and doing this kind of a program.
Though I deeply suspect that John F. Kennedy's life will not disappear in the same way, I think, that Princess Diana's life. I want to bring in our presidential scholar. I tend to call him our residential presidential scholars. We feel so proprietary about him on occasions like this. Michael Beschloss, who's with us in Washington again tonight. Michael, I'm very struck by what John JFK Jr. was never quite sure what to call him because we've known him for so long, right? When he says to Barbara, our mother taught us not to subordinate our lives to the expectations of others. enormously difficult for the children of first families.
Well, that's right, and actually very difficult, very different from his father, because John Kennedy, after World War II, came back home from his heroism in the Pacific. He was very depressed. He thought he might become a newspaperman or something else. It was only because of the death of his older brother, Joe Jr., that his father, Joseph P. Kennedy, almost forced Jack to go into politics. Jack, who was a poor speaker at the time and a very introverted guy. Interestingly enough, it was more John Kennedy's mother, Jackie, who really tried to sort of make her own way in the world and not be bound by expectations. One of the things you always hear about her as First Lady was her saying that she wasn't going to do what all the other First Ladies did. She would do it in her own way.
Michael, I'm struck, too, and have said it before, by how enduring the relationship is with the Kennedys. You were mentioning to me earlier today that in popular polls, even the historians disagree with the notion, John F. Kennedy often comes out as the most popular president.
You said it. You know, we always think of John Kennedy from 1963 and what we knew at the time as this great man who was suddenly cut down and ended this period of Camelot. But it was during the 1970s that we found out other things about assassination plots and women and the underworld that you would imagine would cause Americans at least to think a little bit more skeptically about him and certainly about the entire family. And the amazing thing is that polls in recent years of Americans asking who were the greatest presidents, John Kennedy almost consistently comes out of the top by a pretty wide margin, even over Lincoln and Washington. And I think what this suggests is that people are willing to some extent, see what they want to see. All that was very much projected on John Kennedy Jr. I think they projected all of the good, virtually none of the bad.
I have a question for both of you. First, Barbara, because I've been struck today by how much interest there is in the Kennedys across the generations. Why do you think that is?
They are beautiful people. They were people with a great deal of money. They were people with an enormous amount of charm. When John Kennedy gets married, he marries a beautiful blonde who none of us know very much about. It has all of the trappings that we want to have for people whom we look up to and admire. And at the same time, there is that tragedy, there is what I said before, that vulnerability, there are those aspects somehow of wickedness, and again, the risk takers.
Just one quick note about John F. Kennedy's wife. His sister, his wife's sister on board, was, I think, in the banking business, but we don't know very much about her at all. Lauren Bissett. She was an investment banker. She worked for Morgan Stanley Dean Witter in New York City. And
had a twin sister.
And had a twin sister who was in New York today when all this occurred and has now gone to be with her mother in Connecticut. So that question for you, Michael Beschloss, the enduring fascination with the Kennedys, is it just too obvious?
We're living in an age of celebrity which is dominated by television. We have to sort of find interesting aspects of our public figures that draw us to them. Sure wasn't the case in the 19th century. We didn't care much about Benjamin Harrison's life or private life or life experience. And the other thing I think you have to say is, to some extent, the ever-presence of death and tragedy in the Kennedy saga. John Kennedy's life was more interesting, is more interesting as we read about it today, because you know what happens in the last act. Tragically, I think that's going to be true of his son.
Michael, you're a very serious presidential historian. I mean that absolutely. I mean that very seriously. What do you think about this notion of a curse on the family? Teddy Kennedy once spoke about it in public.
He did, and that was only 30 years ago, and we've seen other evidence of it. You know, you just have to think of, Peter, other families in American history, other famous families, who has had this kind of recurrent, horrible, bad luck and tragedy. Even people who are pretty serious presidential historians do begin to think that maybe there is something to this idea of a curse after all.
Thank you very much, Michael. Please don't go away, Barbara. Thank you for that. That was very enlightening. We're going to continue exploring both this mystery, as we called it at the beginning, what may have occurred in this accident. That is the family compound in Hyannis, to which, as we have said before, the Kennedys retreat in times of tragedy and gather in times of celebration. And they were there today for a wedding of Rory, the youngest child of Senator Robert Kennedy, born after her father was assassinated. So it all mixes up. We'll be back in just a moment.